The year was 1485, and the air was thick with the stench of death and the metallic tang of blood. On the fields of Bosworth, the English crown lay among the bodies of the fallen, a prize for the victor. Henry Tudor, a young and ambitious man, emerged from the chaos, his sword stained with the blood of his enemies. He claimed the throne, and with it, the immense power and responsibility of ruling a kingdom that had been torn apart by years of civil war. This was the beginning of the Tudor dynasty, a reign that would be marked by both grandeur and terror. England, like much of Western Europe, had been ruled by kings for centuries. These monarchs claimed that they were chosen by God to rule, and that their power was divine. This belief was so strong that rebelling against the king was seen as rebelling against God. If a rebel was caught, they faced gruesome punishments, often ending in a painful and public death. But if a rebel won, as Henry did, their victory was seen as a sign of God's will. This was the paradox of Tudor rule. The king's power was absolute, yet it was also fragile. Henry VII, the first Tudor king, knew this well. He had to establish his authority in a land that was still divided and uncertain. He did this through a combination of shrewd politics and the use of fear. Fear was a powerful tool, and Henry used it to keep his nobles in line. He passed acts of attainder, which stripped people of their titles and lands if they were found guilty of treason. He used bonds and recognizances, which were legal agreements that forced people to behave or face financial ruin. It was a harsh and effective method, and it worked. By the end of his reign, Henry had created a stable and prosperous kingdom, but at a cost. The Tudor monarchy was not just about ruling with an iron fist. It was also about maintaining a delicate balance of power. The king needed the support of the nobility and the church, but he also had to keep them in check. This was no easy task, especially when the monarchy passed to a young and inexperienced king like Edward VI, or to a woman like Mary or Elizabeth. In a world where women were often seen as weak and unfit to rule, these queens had to fight hard to maintain their authority. One of the most significant changes in Tudor monarchy came with Henry VIII. In 1534, he declared himself the supreme head of the Church of England, breaking away from the Roman Catholic Church. This was a bold move, and it brought him new powers, but it also created new challenges. The Church, which had once been a powerful ally, now became a source of conflict. The question of whether a child or a woman could exercise such authority was hotly debated, and it tested the limits of Tudor rule. Throughout the Tudor era, the monarchy evolved, adapting to the changing times. The king or queen was expected to lead the kingdom in war, enforce the laws, and manage the affairs of state. But they also had to navigate the complex web of politics, diplomacy, and religion. It was a balancing act, and not every Tudor monarch managed it well. Some, like Henry VIII, were successful and left a lasting legacy. Others, like Edward VI, were cut down in their prime, leaving the kingdom in turmoil. The Tudor monarchy was a time of great change and turbulence, but it was also a time of great achievement. The kings and queens of this era left an indelible mark on English history, shaping the nation into what it would become. Their legacy is a mix of blood, power, and glory, and it continues to fascinate us to this day. As the sun set on the fields of Bosworth, Henry Tudor looked out over his new kingdom. He knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult, but he was determined to make his reign one of the most memorable in English history. The Tudor era had begun, and with it, a new chapter in the story of England. In the years following Henry VII's rise to the throne, many writers have debated the nature of his rule. Some argue that his methods, particularly his use of bonds and recognizances, were signs of a weak and insecure king. J.R. Lander, for example, thought that Henry's mistrust of powerful nobles stemmed from his own inexperience and the fact that he was an outsider, having seized the throne with little support. Lander believed that Henry was well aware of how precarious his position was, and this led him to see even the cautious behavior of the nobility as a threat. Christine Carpenter took this idea further, suggesting that Henry's methods were a sign of his failure to understand and use the traditional relationships between the king and the nobility. According to Carpenter, Henry VII, with no experience in English politics, failed to build the kind of relationships that would have helped him control the localities. Instead, he relied heavily on bureaucrats like Bray, Belknap, Impson, and Dudley. bypassing the local power structures. Carpenter argues that Henry's tactics did not ensure stability. Rather, they made him a constant usurper, always buying or forcing loyalty from his subjects. The real success of the Tudor dynasty, she claims, came from Henry VIII, who rejected his father's policies and removed some of his leading agents. Henry VIII cancelled many of the recognizances his father had imposed, and he explicitly condemned them as illegal. However, Margaret Kindon offers a more sympathetic view of Henry VII. She argues that his response to the challenges he faced was logical given his circumstances. Without a strong and loyal noble class or the financial means to create one, Henry had to rely on existing methods of control to protect a position that was much more vulnerable than historians often acknowledge. Kindon suggests that Henry's success as a ruler should be seen in his intense and pragmatic approach to maintaining his throne, rather than in constitutional theories or institutional development. Benjamin Thompson supports this view, noting that for Henry VII, keeping the throne and passing it to his heirs was the ultimate priority, far more important than the quality of his rule. This pragmatic approach helped him stay in power, even though it did not create the long-term stability that his successors sought. The reign of Henry VII was marked by ongoing threats, such as the continued danger of rebellion up to 1497, the instability following Prince Arthur's death in 1502, and the severe punishment of Lord Burgundy in 1507. These events highlight the sense of crisis that persisted during his rule, a sense that was largely absent in the early years of Henry VIII's reign. Despite these challenges, Henry VII's methods, while not ideal, were effective in keeping him on the throne. In the royal courts of England during the 16th century, life was a grand stage where power, wealth, and influence were the main actors. The court was more than just a place for the king and his family. It was a bustling hub of nobles, courtiers, and commoners all vying for the favor of the monarch. The king's favor could mean a rise in status, a wealthy marriage, or even a piece of land. But it could also mean a quick fall from grace, leading to poverty or even death. King Henry VII, the first Tudor monarch, was known for his shrewd and cautious approach to ruling. After years of war and turmoil, he was determined to secure his position and build a stable kingdom. Henry was not a man to be easily swayed by charm or flattery. He was more interested in the practical matters of governance and finance. He often used his power to control the nobility, who had been a source of trouble in the past. By imposing fines and penalties on those who broke the law, he managed to keep them in check and fill his coffers with their wealth. One of the key ways Henry VII maintained control was through the system of bonds and recognizances. This was a legal tool that required nobles and wealthy individuals to sign agreements promising to behave in a certain way. If they broke these agreements, they could be fined or even imprisoned. This system not only helped to keep the peace, but also provided a steady stream of income for the king. For example, Lord Burgundy was fined a staggering £100,000 for illegal retaining, but the king accepted a much smaller sum of £5,000, payable over 10 years. This was a way to show mercy, while still maintaining the threat of harsher punishment. Henry VII's approach to finance was both clever and ruthless. He was often criticized for being too greedy, but his methods were effective in building a strong and wealthy kingdom. He used his treasury to fund the needs of the state, such as the military and infrastructure. He also used it to reward loyal supporters, ensuring that they remained on his side. However, this approach also made him unpopular with many of his subjects, who felt that they were being unfairly punished and taxed. When Henry VII died in 1509, his son Henry VIII took the throne. Unlike his father, Henry VIII was a charismatic and flamboyant king. He loved the splendor of the court, and was known for his lavish spending on tournaments, banquets, and building projects. Henry VIII also had a keen interest in the arts and literature, and he surrounded himself with talented individuals who could entertain and advise him. One of the most important figures in Henry VIII's court was Thomas Wolsey. Wolsey was a brilliant and ambitious man who rose from humble beginnings to become the Archbishop of York and Lord Chancellor. He was a master of court politics and used his intelligence and charm to gain the king's trust. Wolsey was responsible for many of the king's policies and was a key figure in the administration of the kingdom. However, his power also made him many enemies, and he eventually fell from grace when he failed to secure an annulment of the king's marriage to Catherine of Aragon. Another important aspect of court life was the patronage of the arts. Henry VIII was a great supporter of musicians, artists, and writers. He commissioned works of art, music, and literature, and his court was a center of cultural activity. This patronage not only enhanced the king's reputation, but also provided opportunities for talented individuals to gain recognition and support. The court was also a place of intrigue and danger. Nobles and courtiers were always looking for ways to gain the king's favor, and this led to a lot of competition and backstabbing. The king's favor could be unpredictable, and those who fell out of favor could face serious consequences. For example, Henry VIII's chief minister, Thomas Cromwell, was executed in 1540 after falling out of favor with the king. Despite the risks, the court remained a powerful and influential institution. It was a place where the king's will was carried out, and where the future of the kingdom was shaped. The court was a microcosm of the wider society, with all its complexities and contradictions. It was a place of beauty and brutality, of loyalty and betrayal, and of grandeur and greed. The court of the Tudors was a world that captivated the imagination, and left a lasting legacy in the history of England. In the world of the Tudors, the royal court was the heart of power. It was where the king or queen met with advisors, made decisions, and distributed favors. The court was not just a place of formal meetings and laws, but also a place where personal relationships and favors played a big role. People at the court could become powerful by gaining the king's or queen's favor, and they could use that favor to help their friends and allies. Thomas Wolsey was one of the most powerful men in England during the early part of Henry VIII's reign. He was a cardinal, which means he was a high-ranking church official, and he was also the king's chief advisor. Wolsey was able to stay in power for a long time, which is unusual because Henry VIII was known for changing his mind and getting rid of people he didn't like. So, how did Wolsey manage to stay in such a powerful position for so long? First, Wolsey was incredibly hardworking and organized. He would wake up early in the morning and work until late in the afternoon. He was always available to help the king with whatever he needed. This made Henry trust him and rely on him for many important tasks, but it wasn't just about being hardworking. Wolsey was also very good at managing relationships. He knew how to work with the other important people at the court, like the nobles. Some historians believe that Wolsey was often in conflict with the nobles, using his influence with the king to keep them from challenging his power. For example, he was involved in the downfall of the Duke of Buckingham, who was executed for treason. However, more recent historians think that this conflict was not as big as it seemed. They argue that many nobles actually sought Wolsey's help and support, even sending their children to be raised in his household. Wolsey also had to deal with the king's favorites, the young men who were close to Henry and spent a lot of time with him. These men, like Nicholas Carew and William Carey, could have been a threat to Wolsey because they had the king's ear. But Wolsey was clever and managed to keep them at bay. He convinced Henry to send them on missions and to other places, which kept them away from the court. He also made changes to the royal household, known as the Ordinances of Eltham, which reduced the power of these favorites. The most important factor in Wolsey's success, however, was his relationship with the king. He and Henry worked together as a team, with Wolsey handling a lot of the day-to-day work, while Henry focused on bigger decisions. This partnership worked well for many years, and Henry trusted Wolsey deeply. Wolsey had to be very careful to balance his role as a servant to the king with his own powerful position. He had to be humble and respectful to Henry while also being a strong leader, but even the best relationships can fall apart. Wolsey's fall from power came when he could not get Henry what he wanted most, a divorce from his first wife, Catherine of Aragon. Henry had fallen in love with Anne Boleyn and wanted to marry her, but the church would not allow the divorce. Wolsey tried his best but ultimately failed. This made Henry lose faith in him, and without the king's support, Wolsey's enemies at the court moved quickly to bring him down. Wolsey's story shows that power in the Tudor court was not just about laws and formal positions. It was about personal relationships, favors, and the trust of the monarch. Wolsey was able to stay in power for so long because he was smart, hardworking, and knew how to navigate the complex world of the royal court. But when he lost the king's trust, his power crumbled, and he fell from grace. Thomas Wolsey's rise and fall in the court of Henry VIII is a fascinating tale of ambition, power, and the complexities of royal favor. Wolsey's journey shows us the delicate balance between being a trusted advisor and a political survivor. His ability to understand and influence the king's will was his greatest strength, but it was also what ultimately led to his downfall. Wolsey began his career as a humble priest, and quickly rose through the ranks due to his intelligence and administrative skills. He became the king's almoner, a position that allowed him to get close to Henry VIII. Unlike other counselors who tried to persuade the king to focus on state affairs, Wolsey knew that Henry preferred to indulge in his pleasures. By catering to the king's desires and offering him small, carefully chosen gifts, Wolsey won Henry's trust and affection. This proximity to the king gave Wolsey unprecedented power and influence over the realm. However, Wolsey's success was not without its challenges. He faced opposition from the nobility, who resented his rise and his control over the king. Wolsey's enemies, like the Duke of Norfolk and John Skelton, accused him of using sorcery and charm to manipulate Henry. Despite these accusations, Wolsey's influence grew, and he became the king's darling, trusted with matters of state and diplomacy. Wolsey's political authority lasted for 2 decades, but it ended abruptly in 1529. The primary reason for his fall was his failure to secure an annulment of Henry's marriage to Catherine of Aragon. This failure was a direct affront to the king's will, and Wolsey's inability to deliver on this crucial matter cost him his position. Henry's patience with Wolsey had run out, and the cardinal was arrested and stripped of his titles and offices. Wolsey's story teaches us that in the early Tudor court, the will of the king was paramount. Advisors could influence the king, but they could not control him. Wolsey's success was built on his ability to understand and cater to Henry's desires, but his downfall came when he could no longer meet the king's expectations. The politics of the court were a game of influence and favor, and Wolsey played it with skill, but even the best players can lose when the rules change. Moving to the reign of Elizabeth I, we see a different but equally complex court dynamic. Elizabeth, a woman on the throne, faced unique challenges in maintaining her authority and credibility. The Privy Chamber, which had been a center of political power under Henry VIII, was now dominated by women, and Elizabeth used this to her advantage. She kept men at a distance, ensuring that her female servants could not become faction leaders. This helped her maintain a clear line of authority, and reduce the risk of courtly factions undermining her rule. Elizabeth's court was also marked by the rise of male favorites, like Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, and Robert Devereux, Earl of Essex. These men, who were often physically and personally attractive to the Queen, could influence her decisions and patronage. However, their influence was limited to certain areas, and Elizabeth was careful to keep the core of her administration, led by William Cecil, Lord Burghley, free from their interference. The cultural and ceremonial aspects of Elizabeth's court were also crucial in establishing her authority. Elizabeth's ministers worked to create a majestic and romantic image of the Queen, using events like the Accession Day tilts to reinforce her status as the Virgin Queen. This image helped solidify her rule, and provided a focal point for the loyalty and admiration of her subjects. However, the later years of Elizabeth's reign saw a decline in the effectiveness of her court. The death of key figures like Burghley and Leicester created a power vacuum, and the Queen became more conservative and less accessible. The tension between the aging Queen and her younger courtiers, particularly the Earl of Essex, led to political intrigue and ultimately Essex's rebellion in 1601. This marked a significant decline in the stability and effectiveness of the court, and the last years of Elizabeth's reign were characterized by stagnation and self-seeking behavior among the courtiers. In the end, Thomas Wolsey and Elizabeth I both show us the intricate and often precarious nature of power in the Tudor court. Whether through the personal favor of the king or the careful management of a female monarchy, the ability to navigate the complex political landscape was essential for survival and success.